She came into the world with no ceremony. There was a sound, wet, sharp, biological, and then there was her. Small, green-gray, wrapped in a caul of translucent membrane, already frowning at the universe as though she found it insufficiently organized. The attending medic, a human woman named Korsman Delia Marsh, who had delivered 47 babies in 4 planetary systems and had never once flinched, stared for exactly 3 seconds before she made her decision. She cut the cord. She cleaned the infant. She wrapped her in the nearest warming cloth and held her against her chest and said, in a voice she usually reserved for the dying, "I've got you. I've got you." The infant's eyes opened, pale amber, almost gold, with pupils shaped like horizontal slits. They found Delia's face and stayed there with an intelligence that no 3-minute-old had any business possessing. Delia had seen a lot of newborns. She had seen the unseeing stare of the freshly born, the way they looked at light and faces without understanding either. This child was different. This child was looking at her the way a person looks at a person. "Yeah," Delia said, quieter now. "You've got that look. My grandmother had that look." The birth mother, a Keth-Voral ambassador's aide whose name Delia was not cleared to know, whose presence on the medical bay was documented under a file code she had not been given access to, whose labor had been attended by 2 armed soldiers who stood outside the door and spoke to no one, was already gone. The 2 soldiers were already gone. The file that documented any of this was already, Delia would later discover, entirely gone, erased, reclassified, or simply never properly recorded. What remained was a child, an emergency warming cloth stamped with the sigil of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet, and a decision that Delia Marsh had not been authorized to make but made anyway. She filled out the paperwork herself. Infant female, unregistered species, parents unknown, guardian D. Marsh Korsman, 1st Class, 7th Fleet, name to be determined. She called her Myra because it meant something different in 4 different languages, and all 4 meanings were worth having. In her grandmother's tongue it meant wonderful. In the old trade language it meant observer. In one of the 3 Keth-Voral dialects she would not know Myra spoke fluently until she was 12. It meant one who sees what others miss. Delia chose the name because she liked the sound of it. She didn't learn any of the other meanings for years, but she would come to think later that this was the kind of coincidence that wasn't. It took Myra 3 years to learn to speak and 14 months to figure out that she was different. Not wrong, Delia was extremely clear about that distinction, and she made it early and she made it often, and she made it in the simple declarative sentences that children needed, not the hedged and qualified language that adults used when they were uncomfortable with a truth, but different. The other children in the Fleet housing block were pink or brown or a warm olive tan, and their pupils were round, and they didn't have the secondary eyelids or the faint ridge of subcutaneous cartilage along the forearms that meant, as Delia patiently explained, that Myra could absorb small electromagnetic pulses without flinching. "That's actually very useful," Delia said. "I wish I could do that." Myra filed this away the same way she filed away everything, completely and forever. She was not friendless. There was a boy named Carver whose parents both served in engineering, and who had a talent for finding the maintenance access tunnels, through which 2 small children could traverse most of the station's residential sector unseen. This talent proved extremely useful, as did Carver's complete indifference to the fact that Myra looked different from him. "You see better in the dark than I do," he told her once matter-of-factly when they were 9 and deep inside a conduit passage that connected the secondary habitation ring to the fuel management bay. "That's good. I'm better at not getting caught. Between us we're basically unstoppable." They were caught 3 times that year and logged twice. The 3rd time, Delia sat Myra down and asked her directly what she was trying to find. Not as a reprimand, as a genuine question. Myra thought about it. "Everything," she said. Delia nodded slowly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Then find it properly. Learn the maps before you crawl around in the tunnels. Understand a system before you root around it. That's not safer, it's better." This was the most important thing Delia Marsh ever told her, and she would spend 20 years discovering how true it was. She was small for whatever she was. The Keth Vorel, the species the medics tentatively decided she belonged to, based on coloration and facial structure and certain skeletal markers, were not a small people. The males averaged over 2 meters. The females ran nearly as tall. The subspecies variations within Keth Vorel biology accommodated a range, but even the shortest adult Keth Vorel on record was taller than the average human. Myra, at age 9, was the height of a 7-year-old human child and showed no signs of accelerating. Fleet pediatricians examined her twice a year. None of them could explain it. Their best theory was that the nutrient profile of human food wasn't calibrated to her biology, that she was growing at a rate her body had imposed in order to conserve, that she might catch up at adolescence. She did not catch up at adolescence. What she did instead was learn to use the size. It turned out to be better than catching up. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet was not a peaceful posting. It operated along the edge of what the treaty maps called the Contested Reach, 5 systems of habitable planets, an enormous mineral value that 4 separate species had been arguing over for 60 years, 2 of them violently. Humans had entered the picture late, as they usually did, not with a territorial claim but with an offer to mediate, which had been received with the specific kind of contempt that entities reserve for newcomers who don't understand what they've walked into. The Keth Vorel had been fighting the Dresh Confederacy for 40 years by then. The Dresh had reasons, and the Keth Vorel had reasons, and the reasons had been exchanged so many times in so many failed negotiating rooms that they had worn smooth, like stones in a river, polished past the point of any edge that might have caught something and changed direction. Humans offering to talk about it was, to the Keth Vorel, approximately as welcome as a child offering to explain war to soldiers. The irony of this was not lost on Myra. She grew up on a military vessel, which meant she grew up surrounded by the full taxonomy of human problem-solving. Formal and informal, official and not, the kind conducted in conference rooms with documentation, and the kind conducted in mess halls at the end of second watch with coffee and profanity. She learned systems the way other children learn to read greedily, without prompting, filing away each piece in a mental architecture that grew more elaborate every year. By 12, she could navigate the fleet's administrative network faster than the rated technicians. Not because anyone taught her, but because it interested her, and the things that interested her received her complete and patient attention until she understood them. By 14, she taught herself 3 alien languages from archived intercepted signals, not because anyone asked her to, but because the sounds were interesting and meaning felt like a door she couldn't leave closed. Keth Vorel came first. She had some proprioceptive familiarity with the phoneme range that she couldn't explain but didn't question, then Dresh Standard, then the cross-species trade language that served as a shared pigeon across the reach. She was not merely functional in these languages. She was precise. Languages had registers and textures and the specific weight of words that arrived from history rather than from logic. And she learned those things too, from context and pattern, the same way she'd learned everything else. By 16, she was running secondary diagnostics on the fleet sensor array during her off hours, not officially, but the engineering chief had quietly stopped locking that particular terminal after the 3rd time Myra had identified an anomaly that the official monitoring had missed. Neither of them mentioned it. It was the kind of arrangement the fleet ran on, the official structure and the actual structure, living alongside each other, and the people who understood both were worth more than either. Carver, by 16, was in the junior engineering program and had stopped fitting in the maintenance tunnels. He had retained his complete indifference to things that made other people uncomfortable and added to it a specific talent for explaining complex mechanical systems in terms that non-engineers could follow. "You describe people," he told Myra once, "the way I describe machines. You figure out all the inputs and outputs before you say anything." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It means when you say something, it lands." She filed this away too. Delia, by then, was a chief corpsman and running the medical division of the fleet's forward station. She still had the same kitchen table philosophy she'd had when she was cutting a cord on an unauthorized birth. You do what the situation requires, you document what you can, and you keep the child. The child was now 16 and taller than she had been at 14, but not by as much as anyone had hoped, and she had her mother's directness, and something entirely her own underneath it, something that Delia recognized without being able to name. "You're doing it again," Delia said one evening, when Myra was 17 and sitting cross-legged in the middle of the common room floor with 3 active data screens orbiting around her. "Doing what?" "The thing where you map the whole system before you tell anyone what you found." Myra was quiet for a moment. On the screens, columns of Keth-Vorel Communications traffic scrolled in patterns she'd been watching for 3 weeks. The patterns were not random and they were not routine. She had checked. "There's something wrong with the Concordat negotiations," she said. Delia put down her coffee. "The Keth-Vorel delegation's communication patterns changed 6 weeks ago. The intervals between transmissions dropped by 40%. The linguistic register shifted. There are phrases they're using now that weren't in any of their earlier diplomatic correspondence. I cross-referenced them against Keth-Vorel military archives, specifically the pre-engagement communication sets from the 3 major conflicts in the last 20 years. She paused. "They match. The syntax matches pre-engagement deployment language. Not perfectly, nothing's perfect, but the probability is above 93%. The room was quiet. Through the station's viewport, the nearest inhabited planet in the contested reach turned slowly on its axis, cloud-patterned and patient and containing, according to the demographic surveys, approximately 400 million people of various species who would be very much affected if the Concordat negotiations failed and something else started in their place. "You need to take this to the Admiral," Delia said. "He won't see me." "He'll see me." Delia picked her coffee back up and considered it. "You write the brief, 3 pages. Clear, no qualifications, no hedging, not because the qualifications aren't real, but because the core finding is solid and you know it. And if you lead with the confidence of the thing you know, the qualifications take care of themselves. Say it like you know." Myra had spent 17 years learning when to trust Delia Marsh. "Okay," she said. The brief took 2 hours. She wrote it 4 times, not because the analysis was uncertain, but because she was learning the difference between knowing something and communicating it. The specific art of making a finding legible to someone who hadn't spent 3 weeks with the data. She cut everything that wasn't essential. She put the core finding in the first sentence. She let the evidence follow in order of weight, not in chronological order of discovery, because the reader's time was shorter than her process, and that was not a defect in the reader. The Admiral saw them the next morning. He was a compact, gray-haired man named Vessar who had a reputation for being impossible to surprise, and he read Myra's 3-page brief in 4 minutes and then read it again. He asked her 2 questions. She answered them. He asked a 3rd question that was sharper than the first 2, not skeptical but genuinely probing, the kind of question that wanted to find a weakness so it could know the finding was solid when it didn't. And she answered that one too, with the primary data on the screen in front of him and the corroborating evidence behind it. He sat back. He looked at her with a very particular attention, not at her coloring or her eyes or the cartilage ridges on her forearms, but at her, the way you look at something you're trying to fit into a model of the world and finding that the model needs to be larger. "How old are you?" he said. 17. Who taught you signals analysis? No one. I read the manuals. A pause. The manuals have 3 years of prerequisite study listed in the introduction. I read those too, she said. Then, because she was 17 and still occasionally miscalibrated her moments, the prerequisites weren't prerequisites. They were context. I found it more useful to treat them as parallel reading. He looked at her for another moment. Then he forwarded her analysis to Fleet Intelligence without saying anything further, which was, she would understand later, the highest form of professional acknowledgement in his register. 2 days later, the Concordat negotiations were quietly suspended. 3 Keth-Vorel military vessels that had been repositioning toward the Reach's primary transit corridor were, according to the official communiqué, asked to return to standard patrol routes. They did. There was no public statement about why. There never was. Myra didn't know any of this for another 6 months, when Vessar called her back to his office and handed her a datapad with a formal offer of officer candidacy. You don't belong on a diagnostic terminal, he said. You belong in analysis. Possibly in command eventually, if you want it. She took the datapad. She read it. It says I'd have to formally disclose my species. Yes. I don't know what my species is. Genetically, he said carefully, the preliminary assessment suggests Keth-Vorel. Phenotypically, you're something in between. Legally, you're registered as unregistered, which is a status that exists and is valid but creates certain complications for commissioned rank. He paused. I've been told the complications are manageable. She looked at the datapad for a long time. Outside his window, the contested Reach turned, patient and enormous, the way contested things always waited, not impatient, not urgent, simply present, waiting for whoever would finally do the work of understanding it properly. I'll think about it, she said. She took the commission. She was the first officer in fleet history to list her species as unregistered/probable Keth-Vorel atypical, and have that notation appear on an official active duty commission without being immediately flagged for medical review. Vessar had apparently made some calls. She chose not to ask which ones. The commission formalized what had been the actual situation for several years, which was that she was doing analytical work that mattered, and there was no formal structure for that. The formal structure mattered because it created a record, and records mattered because without them the work could be undone the moment the person who understood it moved on. She had learned this from watching the fleet's institutional memory. The things that survived were the things that got written down properly. She started writing things down properly. She was 20 when she first encountered the Keth-Vorel in person. Not across a table. There were no negotiations running by then, the Concordat having collapsed 4 months earlier in a manner that she could have predicted, and did predict, in a report that was classified before anyone read it. In person meant across a battlefield, which was technically not a battlefield yet because nobody had fired, but which had the quality of something about to be. 2 human patrol vessels and 1 Keth-Vorel warship in an asteroid field on the edge of the Reach's 3rd system. Myra was the junior intelligence officer on one of the patrol vessels, and she was supposed to be reviewing communications intercepts in a secure room. She was reviewing communications intercepts in a secure room until the moment she heard the Keth-Vorel commander's voice on the open channel. She stopped. She'd heard that language her whole life, in archived intercepts and signal data, in the 1,200 hours of Keth-Vorel comm traffic she'd cataloged and decoded in the 4 years since she first noticed something was wrong. She knew it the way you know a language you've taught yourself from recordings precisely, without the muscle memory of having spoken it aloud, without the instinctive shorthand of daily use. She knew what the words meant. She knew the weight of the register. And she knew that the commander was saying that the humans had 30 seconds to withdraw or he would fire, and that he was saying it in the formal military register that she had cross-referenced against pre-engagement syntax 3 years ago, and that he meant it. She was in the communications room before she was aware of deciding to move. "I need a channel to that ship," she said. The comms officer stared at her. "Lieutenant, the channel protocols require." "I know what they require." She didn't say. "I wrote the current revision of the protocol summary. Open it now. There isn't time." He opened it. She spoke in Kethvoral. Not the careful, measured pronunciation of someone working through learned vocabulary, but in the formal military register that matched the commander's exactly, because she knew that in this specific situation anything less than exact register matching would read as disrespect or incompetence, and she had one chance. "Commander, I am speaking to you in your own language because I want you to understand that what I am about to say is deliberate, not accidental. You are operating under a false intelligence assessment. The human vessels in this field were not deployed as an aggressive incursion. They were responding to a distress signal from a mining installation in this sector." She transmitted the communications record as she spoke. "I am sending you that signal and our response orders simultaneously. This is not a negotiating tactic. Verify the timestamps." There was a silence on the channel that had a specific quality. The silence of a man who has encountered something he didn't expect and is making a very rapid decision about how to respond. She let the silence exist. She had learned from watching Delia that the right answer to certain silences was not to fill them. "Furthermore," she said, after the silence had run its appropriate length, "I should tell you that I am Kethvoral, or partly. Something in between. I haven't resolved that question to my own satisfaction. I was born on a human ship to a mother I never knew, and I was raised by a human woman, and I have spent 4 years watching this conflict be driven by errors that neither side chose, and I would very much like it not to continue in the direction it appears to be going." The silence this time was different. It had a different texture. Then the Kethvoral commander said, in the same formal register, with a very slight shift in tone that she would later learn was the Kethvoral equivalent of recalibration, "You were abandoned." It wasn't a question. It was a specific Kethvoral construction, a noun phrase that meant precisely a child removed from the path of their inheritance, a thing displaced from its origin. It was not a cruel phrase. It was an observation of a fact that the Kethvoral taxonomized with careful precision, because they had strong opinions about inheritance and continuity and the obligations of bloodlines. "Yes," she said. "And they kept you." "Not the humans, they." A specific choice of pronoun, pointing toward the woman who had held an infant against her chest in a medical bay and filed her own paperwork. "Yes," she said, "she did." She heard him exhale. It was the first fully biological sound that had come through the channel, not language, just the involuntary sound of a person processing something, and it was, somehow, more meaningful than anything that had come before it. "Transmit your identification, Lieutenant." She did. There was no battle that day. There was a standoff and then a careful withdrawal and then, 6 weeks later, a formal request from the Kethvoral High Council for a direct communication channel to the human 7th Expeditionary Fleet, specifically citing the name and rank of one Lieutenant M. Marsh, Intelligence Division, as the preferred point of contact. Vessar read the request 3 times before calling her in. "They're asking for you by name," he said. "I know. The Council has never made a direct communication request before, not in 40 years of this conflict." "I know." He looked at her with the measuring look he'd been giving her since she was 17 with 3 data screens in a common room. She didn't mind it. People who looked at things carefully were generally less dangerous than people who didn't. "What did you say to that commander?" "I told him the truth about why we were there," she said, "and I told him I was Kethvoral." "Are you?" She had been living with that question for 20 years. She didn't have a clean answer and she had stopped wanting one. "I don't know," she said. "I know what I am. I'm less certain what that maps to in their taxonomy. Their taxonomy isn't what matters here, Vesar said. What matters is that they're asking for you specifically, which means whatever you said, they believe it. And that changes what's possible. He slid a second datapad across the desk. I'm upgrading your clearance level and reassigning you to the Diplomatic Liaison Division, which currently consists of you. She looked at the datapad. That's a very small division. It just became important, he said. She became the intermediary. Not officially. There was an entire diplomatic apparatus that was officially handling whatever remained of the negotiation infrastructure. Senior ambassadors and treaty specialists and people with the titles and the credentials and the experience that she did not have, but the channel ran through her. When the official process stalled, as it regularly did, there was a secondary channel, informal, unlogged, and she and the Kethvoral commander, whose name she learned was Vashrith, and whose position in the conflict's history she would spend months learning to understand, spoke through it on a frequency that neither of them mentioned to their respective chains of command. He was older than she'd expected. Not elderly, but seasoned, in the specific way that people were seasoned by a war they'd been fighting since before they had fully formed opinions about it. He had been a junior commander when the Concordat was first signed, decades earlier. He had watched it fail 3 times in its various forms, and his perspective on failure was not bitter so much as exhausted and precise. He knew exactly which parts of the Concordat had failed and why, in the specific mechanistic sense that a person knows why a machine breaks when they've watched it break in the same place repeatedly. She learned more about the Kethvoral in those conversations than in all the years of archived intercepts combined. Not tactics, they were careful about that, both of them, maintaining a strict discipline about what they shared and what they held back, not out of distrust, but because they understood that trust was built by not asking for more than the moment warranted, but the texture of the conflict, what it had cost, how long people had been waiting for a version of it that didn't require perpetual sacrifice, what the generation that had grown up inside it understood about it. The young soldiers, Vashrith told her once, were tired in a specific way. They had been born into the war. They didn't have a before. Human soldiers feel the same, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You are certain of this? I grew up on a military vessel. I know what tired soldiers look like. I know what it looks like when someone has been doing a thing for so long that they've stopped being able to imagine not doing it. But they continue to fight. So do yours. Another silence. She was becoming expert at reading his silences. Yes, he said, they do. That's the thing about tired soldiers, she said. They keep going, not because they want to, because they don't know what else to do with themselves. The way out of that isn't to give them a reason to stop. It's to give them something to go toward. She was not sure when she said this, whether she was describing soldiers or something else. Both, possibly. The best analyses usually worked on more than one level. The peace proposal that eventually reached both high commands was officially drafted by the diplomatic corps. This was true and accurate, and Myra never claimed otherwise. What she knew, and what Vashrith knew, was that the core of it, the specific architecture of the resource-sharing arrangement in the contested reach, the language around autonomous zone designation, the clause on mixed species advisory panels that had been the sticking point in every previous iteration, had been worked out in those secondary channel conversations. 2 people speaking carefully in a shared language that belonged equally to neither of them, finding vocabulary for things that hadn't needed words before because nobody had tried to say them yet. She thought about this, sometimes, in the way she thought about the things that she didn't fully understand yet. Not with anxiety, but with the patience of someone who knew that understanding was a process, not an event. She was 24 when the High Council requested her presence on the Kethvoral homeworld. It was not a routine diplomatic visit, and Vashrith had warned her about this, through the secondary channel, in terms that were precise enough that she could understand them, and oblique enough that she could choose how to respond. She chose to understand. She had spent her whole life choosing to understand things rather than waiting for them to arrive in a more convenient form. The council had found records. Old records, the kind that predated the war, that predated the 7th Expeditionary Fleet, that predated the events of her birth by 3 generations. Records of a Keth-Voral bloodline that had been significant in the 3rd inhabited system, a line of regional designates and diplomatic representatives whose reach into the Council's history went back further than she had expected. The line had been disrupted during the early years of the conflict. The historical record was vague about exactly how. There were gaps in the archival documentation of that period, consistent with deliberate removal, consistent with the specific kind of institutional forgetting that happened when powerful people wanted specific events to stop being findable. The council had been examining the gaps. And then they had found a certain set of genetic markers in the intelligence file of a human fleet officer named Lieutenant M. Marsh, unregistered/probable Keth-Voral, atypical. The atypicality, it turned out, had a very specific explanation. She told Delia the night before she was due to depart. They were in Delia's kitchen, which was a small and practical space on the station's civilian level that smelled of coffee and medical-grade antiseptic, and had a photograph on the wall of a coastline somewhere on Earth, gray-green water, low cloud, a smear of light on the horizon that might have been sunset or sunrise, impossible to tell. Delia had retired from active fleet service 2 years earlier, and had the specific quality that good people acquired when they stopped performing competence for institutional audiences. A settled directness, nothing wasted, everything clear. So Delia said. So Myra said. They think you're someone. They think I'm the descendant of someone, the daughter of someone who was the daughter of someone before that. She paused. The line they're describing would make me eligible for a seat on the Regional Advisory Council of the 3rd System. It's a minor seat. Advisory only, no executive power, but it's formal and it has standing in the treaty framework. Delia was quiet. She refilled her coffee. She did not offer to refill Myra's because Myra did not drink coffee. She'd tried it at 13, found it tasted like productive burning, and had been drinking a warm, bitter alternative ever since that neither of them had ever named. After 24 years, some things didn't need names. How do you feel about it? Delia said. Myra thought about the question carefully. It deserved a careful answer. I feel like I've been preparing for something my whole life without knowing what it was. The languages, the analysis, the communications work, the negotiations, it was never random. I just didn't know the name of the shape I was moving toward. That's not mystical, Delia said. You've always been like that. You've always reached toward the thing that was real, even when you didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know what I was. You knew, you just didn't have the documentation. Delia set her coffee down and looked at her directly, with the particular attention that Myra had been the recipient of her whole life, not clinical, not parental in the protective sense, but the attention of someone who saw her accurately and had always seen her accurately from the first 3 seconds. You've always known who you are. The question was just who else was going to figure it out. Myra looked at the photograph on the wall, the gray-green ocean, the uncertain light. A place she had never been, on a planet she had visited twice, with a woman who had been there precisely once and chosen, for reasons she had never explained, to put the picture up. You could have left me, she said. That night. They were already gone. The record was already disappearing. You could have documented an unregistered birth and handed me to the system and never thought about it again. No, Delia said. Simply, without inflection, without the specific texture of a decision being made because it was easy. I couldn't. They sat together in the kitchen for a while longer, not talking particularly. The way people sat together, who had been through the specific experience of being each other's whole family at various points, and had come out the other side of it into something more like equals. The Keth-Vorel homeworld was larger than she'd expected. Not impossibly so, she had read the planetary surveys, but there was a difference between numbers and presence, and the presence hit her at the landing dock. The gravity was slightly heavier, the atmosphere was slightly denser, the ambient sound frequencies were tuned to a wider range than human or station architecture accommodated. The sound of it wind through spaces built for a species whose auditory range was broader than hers, the subsonic hum of civic infrastructure that operated below the threshold of conscious hearing, but registered in the body anyway. Voices in a language she knew perfectly but had only ever heard in recordings came at her continuously and didn't stop. She was small there. She had always been small, but on the homeworld the smallness was visible in a new context. She was in the place that had shaped the body type she approximately shared, and she came up short by a margin that was noticeable. Guards twice her height stood at the diplomatic reception entrance. The corridor ceilings were 3.5 meters. The furniture in the reception chamber was built for bodies that her frame did not match. She sat in the chair provided for her, modified, she noted, from the standard council configuration, the adjustment having been made recently, the material still holding the slight artificial stiffness of newness. And she let the room be what it was and focused on the thing she was there to do. Vashrith, who she was meeting in person for the first time, was 1.5 heads taller than she was, and looked at her the way she'd heard he had looked at the asteroid field that day, carefully, with the expression of a person doing rapid recalculation that they are trying not to make visible. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. "I've heard that," she said. "It is not an insult. I expected the manner to match the size. You have a manner that suggests more presence than the frame would indicate. My mother used to say something similar, in different words." Something moved in his face. "Your guardian, the human corpsman." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of something settling. Then, "She chose that." "Yes." He nodded once, the full Keth-Vorel acknowledgement nod, the formal recognition of a significant fact. She had read about it for years. Seeing it aimed at her was different from reading about it. Then she understood something about inheritance that many in my culture would take a full lifespan to learn, he said. The gift given freely is not diminished by being given. It is increased. This was a Keth-Vorel proverb that she had encountered in the archives. Hearing it spoken, in the register in which it was meant, was very different from reading it in a document. The council session was formal, long, and conducted in a register of Keth-Vorel that required her full concentration, not because her language skills were insufficient, but because the formal council register was a variant she'd only encountered in historical documents, archaic constructions layered over the contemporary syntax like sediment over bedrock. She followed it. She answered questions in the same register, which produced a reaction she hadn't entirely expected. A stillness that moved through the chamber like a wave. 12 council members who had been watching her with various degrees of skepticism, shifting into an attention that was something else. The eldest council member, a woman whose age was not calculable from external markers, but whose authority was immediately legible in the quality of the room's attention when she spoke, said something that the translation protocols registered approximately as, "She speaks as the line spoke." There was a discussion she was not included in, conducted in a sub-register she recognized as private address, not excluded through discourtesy but through convention, the way you speak with family before you welcome a guest. She waited. She had spent most of her life waiting for rooms to finish their internal processes, and she had learned to do it without the kind of visible patience that was its own form of impatience. The eldest council member turned back to her and spoke in the register of direct address. "You were taken from the path, through violence, through the decisions of others, through the war that has cost all of us things that cannot be returned. The path does not disappear because someone is removed from it. It does not change course. It waits for the person who belongs on it to find it again. Myra sat with this for a moment. She thought of a 7-year-old child in a maintenance tunnel trying to understand what she was made of. She thought of 17 and 3 data screens and a 3-page brief written 4 times until it was clear. She thought of the asteroid field, the communications room, the channel she wasn't supposed to open, the voice that came out of her in a register she had spent years learning and had never actually tested. "I've been on the path," she said. "I just didn't know what it was." "No," said the council member, and her voice shifted slightly into a register that was neither formal nor informal but something that belonged to a space those categories didn't fully cover. "You knew. You simply did not know the name of it." The title they offered her was not grand, in the scale of Keth-Voral honorifics. Regional Designate, a seat on the Advisory Council of the Third Inhabited System, a position with more symbolic weight than executive authority, designed specifically for the kind of mixed-status role that the peace framework had created room for but had not yet populated. The language of the designation was careful. She would be neither fully Keth-Voral nor fully human in their formal taxonomy, but both at once, and the framework had a word for this now. A word that hadn't existed in their official vocabulary 18 months ago. A word she had been partly responsible for drafting into the treaty text in those secondary channel conversations late at night on a human fleet vessel, because there needed to be a word for it. She accepted the title. She messaged Delia from the homeworld's diplomatic relay station through the fleet communication network, because the secondary channel wasn't calibrated for personal communications, and she needed to say something to someone who would understand what she meant by all of it. "They gave me a seat," she wrote. "It's a small one. I think it's enough." Delia's reply came 4 hours later, through the light lag that was the specific cost of everything being very far apart from everything else. "I know. The council sent a formal notification to my registered address. I'm still listed as your guardian in some system somewhere. I didn't know that. And then, I'm proud of you in a way I don't have words for yet. I'll find the words. Take care of yourself." Myra read the message twice, and then stood for a while at the viewport of the relay station, watching the homeworld's primary moon rise over the horizon, blue-white. Enormous. Nothing like the moon she'd grown up watching through fleet viewports. Nothing like the photograph of the gray-green coastline on the wall of a kitchen on a station she still thought of as home. The first advisory session was 3 weeks later. She was the smallest person in the chamber by a significant margin. The Keth-Voral delegates were the height she had expected. The Dresh Confederacy representative was a compact individual who wore his professional skepticism openly. Not hostile, but waiting to see whether she knew what she was doing, in the specific careful way that people waited who had been burned before by people who didn't. She knew what she was doing. She let the session run for 2 hours before she spoke, not because she was uncertain, but because 2 hours of careful listening is never wasted time, and because the best thing you can show a room that doesn't know you yet is that you are paying attention to it. She filed every stated position and every unstated position, every hesitation in the language, and every place where the phrasing was slightly more aggressive than the content required, which usually meant someone was compensating for a position they felt was weaker than they wanted it to appear. Then she spoke. She used 3 registers: Keth-Voral Formal Council, Dresh Diplomatic Standard, and the cross-species trade language, in a rotation that was partly tactical and partly simply accurate, because some concepts expressed more precisely in one language and some in another, and if you had all 3 available, there was no reason to compress everything into one. She laid out a resource allocation framework that addressed the Keth-Voral's stated primary concern and the Dresh representative's unstated secondary concern, the one that had been visible in the gap between what he was asking for and what he actually needed, which she had identified in the second hour of listening and cross-referenced against the Dresch Confederacy's previous negotiating positions in the archives she had read before arriving. She did this in language that required neither party to appear to have conceded anything to the other, because this was not a detail but a structural requirement. People who felt they had given something up would relitigate it, and she needed the framework to hold. The Dresch representative said, when she finished, "You prepared for the positions we hadn't stated." "I try to prepare for the whole room," she said, "not just the parts that are visible." He studied her. Then he spoke in Dresch, not the diplomatic standard she had addressed him in, but his own native dialect, a test she recognized as a test and received as the compliment it was. "Where did you learn this?" She answered in his dialect, which she did adequately rather than fluently, but adequately was enough. "On a military vessel. We had limited resources and many problems. The problems didn't wait for us to be ready." He smiled a Dresch smile, which was not the same shape as a human smile or a Kethvoral acknowledgement, but was unmistakably the same thing in its content. "I think we can work together." The transit corridor framework passed in that session. It was not a resolution of the conflict. She knew better than to call it that, and she had written into the preliminary preamble carefully, without making it obvious, a specific acknowledgement that the framework was a first structure and not a final one, because she had read 40 years of documents that had called themselves final, and she understood what the word did to a thing that needed to remain alive and adaptable. The conflict had 40 years of sediment. It would take time. There would be sessions that went poorly and crises that the framework wasn't built to handle. She knew this the way she knew everything she knew, precisely and without illusion. But the transit corridor framework passed, and the two delegations left the chamber in a configuration that was genuinely different from the one they'd entered in. And Vashrath, who had attended as an observer, watching from the upper tier with the attention of someone who had been part of this longer than almost anyone, and knew what a real development looked like, caught her eye as she gathered her materials. He gave her the full acknowledgement nod, the formal one. It meant, "I recognize what has been done here." She gave it back. The Cooperative Development Zone designation took 2 more years, 4 more sessions, and one near collapse that required 3 days of continuous work, most of it through channels that no official would have recognized as a formal process, to walk back from the edge. She was 30 that year. She had been in the diplomatic work for a decade, in one form or another, since she was 20, and standing in a communications room asking for a channel she wasn't supposed to open. She knew what she was doing now in a way that she hadn't known at 20, which was not that she knew more facts. She had always accumulated facts. That had never been the limiting factor, but that she knew the texture of it, the specific feeling of a conversation that was moving toward something real versus the specific feeling of one that was circling. The signing ceremony was held on a neutral station in the third system, in a chamber designed to be slightly uncomfortable for everyone, slightly too warm for the Kethvoral, slightly too cold for the Dresch, slightly too dry for the humans. The protocol officer had explained this to her in advance, and she had found it extremely sensible. Nobody should be physically comfortable at a moment that required full attention. Comfort was for after. Vashrath signed for the Kethvoral High Council. His title in the new framework was Special Envoy, and it had been written into the treaty text specifically because the work he and Myra had done through the secondary channel over the years needed a formal name and a formal structure, and the name they'd given it was Structured Dialogue Framework. She had written the definition. She'd been careful about every word. Delia attended. She had no official role, no diplomatic status, nothing that would appear in the record. She attended because Myra had sent her a message 6 weeks earlier that said, "I want you there." Delia had taken leave from her work in the station's medical education program, and she sat in the observer's gallery in her good jacket, the blue-gray one she had owned for 15 years, the one that existed for occasions that mattered, and watched. Myra saw her before the session began. Across the chamber, through the gallery tier, the blue-gray jacket and the steady posture and the expression that had been there since the beginning, paying close attention, ready to make a decision if a decision was needed. She held the look for a moment. Acknowledgement, I see you. I know what you are, I have always known. Delia gave her back the human equivalent of it, a very small nod, barely visible, the kind that had nothing performative in it, and then both of them returned to the room they were in. The treaty was signed. The zone was designated. The communique went to every inhabited system in the Reach and beyond it, describing what had been accomplished in terms that were accurate and official and missing most of the actual story, because the actual story was not the kind of story that fit in a communique. She walked out of the signing chamber into the organized chaos of the aftermath, and she was the smallest person in the corridor, and she had a seat on a council that was building something new from the debris of something old, and she had 40 years of archived mistakes in her memory to make sure she knew which directions not to go. And somewhere behind her, in the observer's gallery, a woman in a blue-gray jacket was watching her go and knowing, with the certainty of the person who had been there first, who had made the first decision, who had held an infant against her chest and filed her own paperwork in the middle of the night on an unauthorized birth, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Myra had known it too. She just hadn't always had the name for it. Some things were given. Some things were earned. Some were simply present in you from before you were born, waiting for the life that would grow up around them and give them somewhere to go. She had all three. She'd been carrying them her whole life. She walked forward into the noise and the work and the next thing that needed to be done, and she was small, and she was exactly the right size for everything that mattered. There was, after the signing, a reception in the adjacent hall that she was technically required to attend for 45 minutes. She attended for 50 because the Dresch representative sought her out specifically, and they spent those extra minutes discussing, in a mixture of his native dialect and the trade language, the second-order implications of the autonomous zone clause for the minor settlements in the corridor periphery that the main framework hadn't addressed. This was the work. Not the ceremony, not the communique, not the historical record that would describe this as a triumph of diplomacy and list the names of people with titles. The work was this: finding the corners that the framework hadn't reached and building the scaffolding that would let someone get there. She had always known this, in the same wordless way she had known things before she had names for them. But now she had the names too. Vashrith found her as the reception was ending, when the room had thinned to the people who were still in conversation rather than the people who were there to be seen. He was carrying a small container, Keth Vorel in style, old, the kind of object that had been handled by many people over a long time. This belonged to the line, he said. He placed it on the table beside her with the care reserved for things that had weight beyond their physical weight. The council decided it should go to the designate. I argued for delivering it in this context rather than through formal channels. He paused. Some things should be given by a person, not a process. She looked at the container. She didn't open it then. Thank you, she said. And then, in the register that meant something slightly different from simple gratitude, the one that acknowledged that what was being recognized was the gesture, not just the object. For this, and for the day in the asteroid field. You thanked me at the time, he said. You deserved it again. Something moved in his face, the specific arrangement of Keth Vorel features that mapped to the emotion she had learned, over years of secondary channel conversations, to read as something adjacent to the feeling of a thing finally being in its right place. He gave her the acknowledgement nod for the second time in their shared history. You were always going to find this path, he said. I believe that. I think you believe it too. I believe I was always going to look for it, she said. The path existed. Whether I found it, she paused. That depended on a lot of people making decisions that weren't required of them. Yes, he said, That is also true. He looked at her steadily. Your guardian made the first one. Yes. And you have made many since. That's the thing about not knowing where you're going, she said. You make a lot of decisions. Some of them turn out to be right. He considered this. Is that the human philosophy? She thought about Delia's kitchen, and the 3-page brief she had written 4 times, and a communications channel she had opened on no authority except her own judgment, and 40 years of archived conflict that nobody else had bothered to fully read. She thought about the word her name meant in the Kethvoral dialect she hadn't known when she was named, one who sees what others miss. I don't know if it's a philosophy, she said. It's more like a practice. You pay attention, you do the work, you stay on the path even when you don't know what it's called. She picked up the container. It was heavier than its size suggested, and warm in the specific way that things were warm that had been held by many hands over a long time. And when someone holds the door open for you, you walk through it. He nodded. Not the formal acknowledgement this time, but something smaller and more personal, the gesture that belonged to the end of a long conversation rather than the beginning of one. She said goodbye to the Dresch representative and 2 members of the council, and made her way back through the station to the transit point, carrying the container. She had a report to write, the kind that wouldn't appear in the official record, but that would live in the institutional memory of the Diplomatic Liaison Division, which was now considerably larger than it had been when it was just her. She had 3 secondary channel follow-up conversations to schedule. She had a briefing to give to the junior analyst who had joined her team 6 months ago, and who had the same quality she'd had at 17, that quality of reaching toward the thing that was real before you had a name for it, and who needed someone to give her what Vessar had given Myra. The datapad, the clear-eyed expectation, the implicit statement that this is the work and you are ready for it. And she had a message to send. She sent it from the transit point before she boarded. I have something to show you. I'll be back in 3 weeks. Save some of the not coffee. Delia's reply came 3 hours later in the light lag. It's already waiting. Come home. She boarded the transport. The homeworld fell away behind her, enormous and loud, and mapped now in her body, the way places became mapped when you had stood in them and worked in them, and understood them as the thing that they were rather than the thing you'd imagined them to be before you arrived. The contested reach. It would keep that name for a while. Names persisted past their accuracy, the way old words persisted in formal registers after the common usage had moved on, turned below as they broke into transit space, cloud-patterned and inhabited, and containing its 400 million people who were living in a changed situation, without knowing exactly what had changed or how. That was fine. She had always been comfortable being the person who understood the systems before the systems announced themselves. She had learned it in maintenance tunnels at 9 years old. She had practiced it every year since. The work was not glamorous and it was not finished. Work of this kind was never finished, only continued, and it required more than anything else the specific human skill of staying in the room after the moment of triumph and asking what needed to happen next. She pulled out the first draft of the follow-up framework and started reading. The transport entered transit space. The stars rearranged themselves. She kept reading. She was small for whatever she was. She had always been small. It had never, in the end, been the point. What she was, in the taxonomy that mattered, was someone who paid attention, someone who stayed on the path even when she didn't know its name, someone who had been given 3 kinds of inheritance and had been careful with all of them. She was the daughter of a woman who had made a decision in a medical bay in the middle of the night, on no authority except her own judgment, and had stuck with it for 24 years. She was the heir to a line that had been waiting for her to find her way back to it. And she was, in the specific sense that could not be taxonomized by any species formal system, entirely herself. The thing that happened when 2 kinds of people made room for each other, and something new walked through the door they left open. She read the follow-up framework until the transit completed, and she made notes in the margins in 3 languages. And when the stars rearranged themselves back into recognizable patterns, she looked up for a moment and thought of the gray-green ocean in the photograph on a kitchen wall, the uncertain light on the horizon that could have been sunrise or sunset. Impossible to tell. She had learned, somewhere in the last decade, that it didn't matter which one it was. What mattered was that the light was there. What you did with it was up to you. She closed the framework document, flagged her notes for the team, and let herself, just for the remaining hour of the transit, sit with the specific feeling of something that had been in process for 24 years arriving, finally and completely and without fanfare, at where it had always been going. Then she opened a new document and started writing the next brief. That was who she was. That was what she did. It was enough. It was, in every language she spoke, exactly enough.